You finally stop arranging yourself around everyone else, and the guilt that rises in you is heavier than anything you have prepared for. Carl Jung does not name that guilt as your moral compass. He names it withdrawal, the nervous system pulling you back toward what once kept you safe. And somewhere just ahead, the road divides into two paths, where healing and going numb wear the exact same face. You left the message there, unsmoothed and unapologized for. You said no and refused to justify it even once. And instead of the relief you were promised, a guilt so bodily that your entire frame leans toward reversing it. Before this is over, you will understand clearly whether what you are doing is truly healing or simply becoming distant. You will finally see what all that accommodating was actually built from. The agreement a small, frightened version of you made before you had the words for it. You will understand why releasing it sets off an internal warning that has nothing to do with morality. You will witness the people who depended on your compliance push hard to restore it. And you will mourn in a way that reaches back through your entire history and gently revises it. And you will arrive at the fork that softer tellings of this story always quietly skip past, where genuine transformation and simple emotional shutdown wear indistinguishable faces. Accommodating everyone was an armor you wrapped yourself in so that no space around you would ever grow hostile, and you confused that armor with genuine warmth. Laying it down can finally allow you to generate your own heat on no one else's conditions. Picture a woman. Call her 60. For as long as anyone in her life can remember, she is the person you reach for when everything unravels. The friend who shows up earliest and stays longest. The one who mends what everyone else shatters. The quiet, steady center around which the disorder of other people endlessly orbits. She has a single, small, but revealing habit. Every time she manages to say no to someone, she immediately begins composing a message to cushion it, a quiet apology for the limit she just placed, and her finger lingers over the send button until the guilt overtakes her and the message disappears into the other person's inbox. She has repeated this ritual for 4 decades without ever pausing to wonder why. To truly understand the armor she has been wearing all these years, you have to return to the home where she first put it on. She learned to sense the atmospheric pressure of every room before her feet ever found the floor in the morning, to feel which grown person was bending under something unbearable and how near they were to collapse. And she learned the arrangement that every tender-natured child in an unpredictable household eventually learns. If she stayed uncomplicated, if she quietly removed the weight from them before they ever had to bear it, the room remained safe and welcoming. Love came through the door with a single attached condition, that she cost the people around her nothing. Jung gave a name to the self we construct for exactly that purpose, the persona, the face carefully assembled to remain acceptable to the people we have no capacity to lose. Hers settled into a very specific shape. The caretaker, the one others called good. The person who requires nothing and perceives everything and silently absorbs whatever the room finds too heavy to hold. It was not dishonesty and it was not fragility. It was the most sophisticated response available to a small person who had no room to be a weight on anyone. There is a more difficult truth buried beneath all of this, one the gentler accounts tend to leave undisturbed, and Jung moves directly toward it. A person who fully merges with their own polished role does not actually neutralize their inner turbulence. They transfer it silently to whoever happens to be nearest, who then absorbs it into their own body as a real and lasting cost. The peaceful one remains at peace because someone in the room beside them is settling the debt inside their own nervous system. You have often been both of those people simultaneously, the one who took the entire weight of the room into yourself, and the one who settled that account afterward, in the ribs, in the tightening of the throat, in the sleepless hours spent replaying everyone else's burdens through the corridors of your own body. You already know that cost at a depth that requires no explanation. The heaviness and depletion that takes up residence behind your sternum after a night spent absorbing everyone else's friction. The feeling of being completely hollowed out by a room in which, to any outside observer, nothing of real consequence occurred. You have always told yourself that exhaustion was simply the honest cost of being someone who genuinely cares. It was the toll for being the space where the room deposited itself, the invisible container for every emotion no one else was willing to hold. That is the nature of the arrangement. Every mood that required steadying, every disappointment that needed softening, every silence you felt compelled to fill, you gathered all of it onto your own frame so the room would remain hospitable. And to create room for all of that, you had to tuck away your own interior landscape, your own refusals, your own fury, your own desires. Each of them folded down into the dark to keep you uncomplicated and easy on the people around you. You have carried this armor for so long, layer pressed upon layer, that you can no longer distinguish which of the weights underneath ever genuinely belong to you. Your sensitivity was never the uncomplicated blessing the people around you made it sound like. So the estrangement you are beginning to feel now is the first movement of a self that has been buried beneath all that accumulated weight for decades, at last beginning to breathe. An armor you first put on at 6 has become a prison by the time you reach 60, and on the day you first attempt to remove even one layer of it, your own body will resist you with everything it has. What greets you first when you begin to lay the armor down is not liberation, but a sharp internal warning signal. A surge of guilt so instantaneous and so fully embodied that you will be absolutely certain you have committed some kind of transgression, and your entire system will move toward reversing the decision before the sensation has even fully taken shape. This is the moment that demands accurate reading, because nearly everything that follows hinges on it. Accommodating others kept you secure with such consistency and for such an extended stretch of time that your nervous system cataloged it as a survival strategy. It never registered compliance as something generous. It registered compliance as the mechanism by which you remained desired, and remaining desired as the mechanism by which a sensitive small person remained protected. So when you cease, the body does not interpret this as a sound and mature choice. It reads it as a direct danger to your existence and responds with the full force of that assessment. What that guilt genuinely is, then, is the sound of a very old agreement calling in a balance you had no idea was still outstanding. Your sense of moral right and wrong has almost nothing to do with it. The woman encounters this alarm for the first time when she allows her adult son to remain inside a difficulty of his own making rather than silently dissolving it for him. Within the hour, her hands are already moving toward her phone, the cushioning message half composed, the apology for the limit she set already assembling itself on the screen. Her body is completely convinced that if she does not send it, something catastrophic will follow, that he will pull away, that the warmth between them will drain out of the room and never find its way back. None of this is thought. It is the old contract calling in what it is owed, carrying 40 years of weight behind every word. It moves through the body in patterns you can almost map once you begin to observe them with any attention. The throat that constricts around the refusal, the stomach that falls when a message goes unread for an hour, the sudden overwhelming certainty that you are obligated to justify yourself, to produce several reasons, to render the no gentle enough that no one in its path could conceivably feel its edges. Every single one of those sensations is the identical warning dressed in a different form. and every one of them is making the same request of you. Lift the armor back from the floor and wrap it around yourself once more. The particular cruelty of this phase is that the people nearest to you, and sometimes the very resources you turn to for guidance, will validate the alarm. They will tell you that the guilt is proof you overstepped. And so you send the message. You retrieve the armor. The relief that follows is genuine and immediate, and the cage shuts around you again so quietly and so softly that you could almost believe you have arrived somewhere safe. But pay attention to what that relief silently demands of you. Every time you respond to the internal warning by retreating, you confirm to your nervous system that its assessment was accurate, and you make each subsequent refusal more difficult rather than less. The body can only come to understand that holding a limit is survivable by being allowed at least once to survive the holding of it. There is no softened version of this where the guilt gives you the decency of waiting until you have already built some resilience. It arrives first, at full intensity, while you are still at your most unsteady, and the entire task of this passage is to allow it to pass through you without surrendering to it. So the internal signal is the first toll on this road back to yourself. The second one does not originate within you at all. It comes through the door from outside, and it arrives in the faces of the very people you have always loved most. The instant you set down the weight you have always carried, the people whose ease was built entirely on you. Carrying it will sense something go cold in the atmosphere between you, and a number of them that will surprise you will move, mostly without being aware that they are doing so, to restore the old dynamic precisely as it stood. There is a reason this strikes with such accuracy, and Jung identifies exactly what drives it. In the longest and most intimate of relationships, the boundary between where you end and the other person begins has slowly and imperceptibly dissolved. You cease to function as two distinct people finding agreements together and instead become one unified arrangement sustained entirely by your own ongoing self-disappearance. Your stability calms them. Your agreement absorbs their surplus. They have never actually encountered you as a person with boundaries of your own. They have encountered you as a permanent and unchanging feature of their personal landscape, as unremarkable and expected as the infrastructure running silently through the walls of a house. So when you shift, it does not register to them as your development or expansion. It registers as a malfunction in their own environment. The resistance that follows arrives in a sequence so predictable you could nearly use it to mark time. First comes the gentle pressure, the light mockery, the small performances of injury, the playful pull of "this just isn't who you are." Then, when none of that succeeds in returning you to your previous shape, the harder characterizations begin. You have become cold. You have turned selfish. You have decided you are somehow superior to the people around you. To someone who depended on your yielding as the thing that kept their own life from tilting, your first unambiguous act of self-protection does not register as a personal limit. It registers as a fundamental betrayal, and in some cases, as a declaration of hostility. It does not confine itself to how they engage with you now. It extends backward into everything that came before. You will learn, typically through a third voice, that the account of who you have always been has been quietly and thoroughly revised. The steadiness you extended across so many years is now characterized as spinelessness. The limit you at last drew is reframed as deliberate unkindness. Your withdrawal is described as a calculated and cold abandonment of people who gave you nothing but love. This is the shadow in motion, the unacknowledged and rejected dimensions of who they are in search of a place to settle. And your newly firm refusal to receive them makes you the most available surface they can find. But some of that resistance is carrying a truth you must not avert your eyes from simply to protect yourself from the sting of it. A portion of those connections were constructed entirely on your being borderless, on the inexhaustible yes, on the absolute assurance that you would perpetually choose their ease above your own. When you stop, the abrasion you feel is the sound of an arrangement dissolving that was never truly a meeting of two equal people. They were never devoted to the person who helped. They were devoted to the help itself. And someone who built the architecture of their daily existence around your permanent accessibility will always experience your first firm limit as a form of cruelty, because their entire arrangement depended on you never possessing one. The woman receives this the way it almost always arrives, indirectly and softened. A shared friend mentions cautiously that people have been commenting on how removed she has seemed, that someone felt the absence of her call. The familiar internal engine engages in her at once, the pull toward the message, toward the explanation, toward apologizing her way back, into the warmth of everyone's regard. And somewhere beneath that familiar pull, for the very first time, something stiller and more unsettling surfaces. A thought that unnerves her far more deeply than the guilt ever managed to. The thought that perhaps she is simply done with every one of them. Stay with that thought for a moment, because it is the snare, and it remains 2 steps away from being something you can safely put your hands around. When the resistance finally subsides, what remains in its wake is not rest, but mourning, and it is a more unfamiliar kind of mourning than simple solitude, because it will not stay contained in the present moment. It reaches behind you and revises everything that came before. What the woman finds in the silence after the friendships have thinned is more difficult than any of the departures themselves. Some of them did not leave out of cruelty. They left because the role she occupied for them simply no longer exists. And the role was everything the relationship was built on. There was never a person beneath it that they had formed a genuine attachment to. There was a service, a warmth, a dependable place to deposit their hardest days. And once the service ended, there was nothing remaining that could hold them in place. That is the element that extends backward through everything. She looks at 2 decades of what she called a friendship, and can no longer distinguish how much of it was genuine feeling and how much was simply convenience dressed in the clothes of genuine feeling. This is a particular and devastating kind of loss, and it cuts more deeply than plain isolation, because isolation at least allows your past to remain unquestioned. This reaches into the past and takes it with it. You move back through the shared meals, the conversations that stretched past midnight, the long years of being the person everyone leaned on without question. And you cannot find a single moment in any of it when one of them turned toward you and asked what weight you were carrying. You move through the entire length of your history of giving and search for one instance, one solitary moment, where someone thought to extend something back toward you, and you cannot find it. There is a specific kind of memory that tends to emerge in this stillness, and it carries a sharper sting than the emptiness itself. It is the understanding that you were frequently an active participant in your own erasure, and told yourself that this was what it meant to be grown. The moments you held back the accurate and cutting observation because it would have unsettled someone too tender to receive it. The perspectives you smoothed into something harmless, the aspirations you kept below the surface, the entire range of who you actually were, deliberately suppressed so that no one nearby would feel overshadowed or made insufficient by your presence. You did all of that across decades and recorded it in your own accounting as virtue. The morning is arriving at the sudden and total recognition that it was a sustained act of self-abandonment, and that the people who formed their affection for the diminished version of you never had any awareness that a fuller, truer version existed and was waiting to be known. Jung is direct about the particular quality of aloneness that inhabits this space. It is not the aloneness of a room with no one in it, but the aloneness of holding something real and genuine that the people surrounding you are either unable or unwilling to take in. The room can be crowded, and the messages can keep arriving, and you can exist inside all of that motion more profoundly isolated than you have ever been in your life, because the dimension of you that has finally come alive is precisely the dimension none of them ever showed up to encounter. You must allow this mourning to be genuine, and you must also allow it to complete itself. It is the necessary period of darkness, the passage through which the former self and the former connections genuinely end, and in which nothing new has yet had the time to take root and grow. Move through it too quickly, fill the space too hastily with new people to accommodate, and you will simply reassemble the prison with newer materials. Remain inside it too long, however, and let it calcify, and it becomes the entrance to the most seductive error a person in the middle of awakening can make. Because grief that is allowed to thicken and turn will present you with what appears to be a way out that feels indistinguishable from genuine power. And that apparent exit is the exact snare this entire passage has been moving toward since its very beginning. This is the branching point, and the gentler accounts of this journey accelerate past it without stopping. Releasing the weight you have carried can become a true return to yourself, or it can turn into a newer and colder form of self-protection that from the inside is completely indistinguishable from genuine restoration. The wrong direction feels like a rival, and that is precisely what gives it its power to mislead. After an entire life spent submerged beneath the emotional weight of everyone around you, you find that you can simply cease absorbing them. You can survey the room and observe with a clean and almost comfortable detachment that these people lack depth, that they were never doing anything other than taking from you, that you can read every single one of them without obstruction. The depletion lifts, the guilt falls silent, and what rises in their absence is a composed and almost tranquil certainty of being finally, at long last, elevated beyond all of it. The deeply feeling person who once could not silence the emotional noise has become someone who registers nothing and has concluded that the stillness is a form of enlightenment. Jung has an exact term for this state, and it is not liberation. It is inflation. What was intended to be consciously received and woven into the whole of who you are is instead consumed in its entirety, and the ego expands to fill the space around it. You descended in search of the self you had long suppressed, and return to the surface having arrived quietly at the conclusion that you are exceptional. The reason it is nearly impossible to detect in yourself is that from within, it is entirely indistinguishable from having at last arrived at genuine clarity about the people in your life. The sign is small but decisive. When something is truly perceived with honesty and depth, the perceiver remains somewhere within the frame. The cold shift removes itself entirely from every situation it evaluates and retains only its conclusions about everyone else. In the end, you did not remove the heavy armor at all. You found a colder version, tailored to appear indistinguishable from liberation. And the most devastating part is that you cannot perceive that you have put it on. You can identify the particular chill of that satisfaction if you are willing to be honest with yourself. The subdued pleasure of being present at a gathering and privately arriving at the conclusion that no one else in the room has any real awareness of what is actually occurring, that only you can see it. It disguises itself as clarity of perception. It is much closer to a place of concealment. You use their supposed inability to see as a shield against the more demanding truth, which is the solitude that waits for you in your own empty room, and the interior labor that remains there for you whenever you cease surveying everyone else long enough to turn your attention inward. And the most pitiless dimension of all is what the cold shift does to the very isolation it was supposed to resolve. The caretaker was at the very least encircled by people. Even when the encirclement was empty of real substance, the cold version is solitary by its own construction and assures itself that the aloneness is evidence of its superior understanding. Every person it dismisses is one more threshold it softly draws closed until it has enclosed itself inside a space entirely of its own construction and names that enclosure wisdom. So the cold direction preserves the very isolation it was meant to dissolve and simply gives it a different name, calling it freedom, and locks it permanently in place. You can recognize the shift in a particular kind of voice, the one that has absorbed every piece of available knowledge and now assigns diagnoses to everyone it encounters. The one that offers back to others their own wounds. Without being asked for it, that has steadily reinterpreted every connection it lost as confirmation that those others lacked the capacity to receive what it had to offer. The genuine perception beneath it was often accurate. What it crystallized into, a fixed and immovable ceiling of quiet contempt beneath which no one in its presence is ever permitted to ascend, is what converted what might have been a threshold into a point of no return. There is a direct way to examine which version you are actually living, provided you are willing to direct the question inward rather than outward. Ask whether anyone remains in your life whose honest and unvarnished word about you can still reach you. Ask whether even one person has access to you that would allow them to say, what you are calling perception is actually fear, and whether you would genuinely receive that rather than quietly categorizing them among the unaware. The cold shift removes every such person from your world one by one and designates the vacancy that accumulates as liberty. It is not liberty. It is the identical concealment it has always been, constructed now from a more severe material. And there is a more layered irony embedded in this, one that Jung pressed most directly upon those whose nature it is to care for others. The ancient impulse to rush toward everyone's rescue was never solely an expression of generosity. A portion of it was a strategy for maintaining your hold on the warmth of the room, a way of sparing yourself the painful discomfort of watching someone you care for struggle without intervention. Becoming emotionally sealed does not eliminate that impulse. It simply inverts its direction and keeps the underlying engine engaged. You no longer organize your existence around being indispensable to others. You organize it around requiring nothing from anyone, which is the identical arrangement observed from its opposite side. The drive did not conclude. It merely shifted the mask it presents to the world. The woman arrives at this branching point without recognizing it as one. In the aftermath of the morning, the disdain would be such a welcome reprieve. It would feel so entirely justified to conclude that every person who ever drew on her reserves was simply extracting from her, to carry her solitude as though it were a judgment pronounced upon every one of them. It demands nothing from her. It permits her to hold every injury intact while positioning herself above it rather than inside it. The colder armor is already taking shape across her shoulders, heavier than any layer she released. And she cannot sense it arriving because protection that confirms your own superiority never registers as protection. It registers as an accurate account of everyone around you. So the question is no longer whether you are capable of releasing the compulsion to accommodate. You have already crossed that threshold. The question is whether you can do so without exchanging the role of devoted caretaker for the role of silent adjudicator. And distinguishing between these two roads ultimately rests on one essential thing. The indicator is simple, and once it has become visible to you, you will never again be able to look past it. A wall requires the other person to be a source of harm. A genuine limit does not. Observe what each of these two paths does with the people around you, because that is where each one reveals its authentic character. The cold version, the heavier and more isolating armor, needs every person outside of it to be vacant or oblivious or exploitative, because its entire sense of having arrived at freedom depends entirely upon that contrast. The restored version requires none of that. It can hold a firm and clear limit with someone it continues to love, continues to regard with genuine respect, continues to want well for, and feel absolutely no requirement to cast them as a wrongdoer in order to feel secure within itself. You release the weight, and you allow the other person to retain their own dignity in the act of doing so. This is the very possibility the cold version has no access to, because it holds as an article of faith that the only alternative to being consumed is to go entirely still. There is a third possibility, and it is the entire purpose of this passage. You do not cease to feel the people around you. You feel them with the same precision and depth that you always have. The shift in the air as they enter the room, the distance between what leaves their mouth and what is actually moving beneath the surface, all of it undimmed. What shifts is that the sensation ceases to function as an instruction. You can receive the full weight of someone's distress and remain unenlisted into resolving it. You can perceive the disruption emanating from another person and arrive quietly at the recognition that it belongs to them to hold. Jung identifies this as the distinction between being overtaken by an emotion and being guided by one. The very same depth of feeling that once pushed you below the surface becomes, along this road, a precise and trustworthy instrument of perception. You can see this operating in something as everyday as encountering an unfamiliar person. You perceive the recognizable hollow beneath a pleasant expression, the quiet appraisal running just below the surface warmth. The earlier version of you would have either moved swiftly to close that gap or second-guessed your own reading and lingered far too long to be certain. Now you simply register it the way you might register the time of day and allow the situation to remain where it is. There is no effort to unmask them, no judgment rendered, no requirement to have your perception confirmed somewhere down the line. You perceived it clearly, you trusted yourself, and made your choice accordingly. It required nothing whatsoever of the other person. The liberation concealed within that is precisely the one Jung addresses most directly to those who have spent their lives rescuing others. You are permitted to allow the people you love to encounter the outcomes of their own decisions. There are lessons that can only be absorbed by someone who has been allowed to stumble, and the resistance of that stumbling is sometimes the only thing capable of reaching them. When you move quickly to cushion every setback, you are not consistently protecting them. There are times when you are silently depriving them of the very difficulty they required, and sparing yourself the demanding and loving discomfort of remaining still and allowing them to move through it on their own. The woman comes to understand the contours of this gradually, in quiet, small moments, rather than a single decisive clarity. A close friend reaches out in genuine anguish late at night, and she remains present on the line for a full hour, receiving all of it without reservation. And when the call ends, she does not bring it with her into sleep. It was real, and it was not hers to carry through the night. Her son makes another choice that will cost him. And she feels the familiar impulse rising, the pull toward the phone, the rescue, the apology on his behalf. And this time she allows her hand to settle into stillness. She loves him with enough depth now to permit him to encounter his own existence directly. The message of softening remains unwritten, and for the first time, the absence of it does not feel like abandonment. It feels like a form of regard for him and for herself. So the branching resolves, and it resolves into something more grounded than either being consumed by the room or sealing yourself away above it, which leaves only the most quietly posed question of all. When you at last cease to be the coat everyone wraps themselves in, who is genuinely present and remaining in the room beside you. And so this is where you arrive, and it is a still place rather than a glorious one. When the accommodation ceases, the crowd recedes, and the room becomes quieter than it has been at any point in your adult life. For a time, that stillness is terrifying, because you spent decades measuring the validity of your own existence by the volume of people who depended on you to be present in it. But attend to who is left once the noise has settled. The ones who remain are the ones who never required you to diminish yourself to be around. They arrived for the person and not for what the person could provide. And while the room was crowded and you were occupied with carrying the weight of everyone in it, you did not always have the capacity to distinguish them from the others. In the stillness, they come into view. There are not as many of them as your fear prepared you to expect, and they carry more genuine substance than your hope dared to imagine. And it becomes clear that a small number of people who can truly encounter all of you is a form of richness that the crowd in all its years never once offered. The quality of the aloneness itself undergoes a transformation. There is a night early in this new way of moving through the world when you decline an invitation you would once have compelled yourself to attend, and you wait, tensed, for the familiar emptiness to arrive. It does not arrive. What comes in its place is a still, almost bodily sense of ease, the sensation of a room containing precisely the number of presences it was meant to hold, even on the nights when that number is only you. You cease requiring the crowd to confirm that you are real and that you matter. Your depth of perception does not depart in any of this. It only redirects its labor. For the great majority of your life, it flowed in a single direction, inward, scanning yourself for whatever required adjustment, so that no one in your proximity would be made to feel uncomfortable. Now it orients outward and settles into something closer to a clear and unencumbered way of seeing. You enter a space and you perceive it with precision, the warmth that is genuine and the warmth that is constructed for effect. And you no longer feel any urgency to bridge that gap or feel shame for having perceived it in the first place. You feel all of it, and you are directed by none of it. The guilt, the old internal warning that set this entire journey into motion, does not vanish so much as forfeit its jurisdiction over your choices. It still sounds, occasionally, out of the momentum of 4 decades of conditioning. The difference is that you no longer receive it as a sentence handed down. You feel it lift and pass through you the way an old wave passes through, and you allow it to recede, and you leave the armor where it lies. The woman sits one evening before a message she has resolved not to cushion, the apology she will not deliver illuminating the screen for a moment and then disappearing into the darkness. And in the place where the panic once resided, there is only a grounded and clear stillness. She did not become numb. She had simply, at long last, become honest. You stopped accommodating everyone without condition. You were deeply afraid that doing so would transform you into the very kind of person you had devoted your entire life to protecting those around you from. Someone sealed and elevated and unmoved by anyone's pain. It did not. You released the weight that was never rightfully yours to hold. You mourned the spaces that only ever had a use for the function you performed. You moved past the seductive invitation of disdain without accepting it. And you kept the one thing that was always authentically yours, the capacity to feel deeply while at last releasing the compulsion that had always been bound to it. That is not numbness. That is the entirety of you, present in the room at last, generating your own warmth on your own terms and requiring no one's authorization to occupy the space you are standing in.